afternoon. I'm Lisa Dempster. I'm the director of the Melbourne Writers Festival, and I'm so excited to be here at the Sydney Opera House this afternoon for this Festival of Dangerous Ideas event with Laurie Penny. Laurie Penny, I'm sure, needs no introduction to this audience. She's a feminist, journalist and author whose books include Unspeakable Things, Cybersexism and Meat Market. She writes and speaks on social justice, pop culture, gender issues and digital politics for numerous news sources, including The Guardian, The New York Times, Vice and Salon. Today, Laurie Penny will be talking about lost boys. The restrictive gender norms women have fought against are just as constraining for men. But giving up male privilege is not easy or painless. Do men see such a difficult and uncomfortable process as worth it, even if the result would be a better and fairer world for all? Please join me in welcoming to the stage Laurie Penny.
Oh gosh, it's bright. Thanks everyone. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a short piece from a chapter of my book called Lost Boys, and then we're going to do some Q&A and get to the real meat of the stuff. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and their elders past and present and their ongoing struggles for justice. So thank you. Right. For many centuries, money, power, and the ability to create large amounts of random bloody carnage have been concentrated in the hands of a few men, usually white men, usually European men, and usually the richest and the most well-connected. Between them, these men represent only a fraction of the total male population, and yet every man and boy is expected to aspire to be just like them. And every woman is expected to aspire to be in their company. There's a simple word for this system. The word is patriarchy. Patriarchy does not mean the rule of men. It means the rule of fathers, literally the rule of powerful heads of household over everybody else in society. Men further down the chain have always been expected to be content with having power over women in order to make up for their lack of control over the rest of their lives. The word patriarchy is a particularly hard one to hear, describing as it does a structure of economic and sexual oppression centuries old, in which only a few men were granted power. Patriarchy, not the rule of men, but the rule of fathers and of father figures. Most individual men do not rule very much, and they never have. Most individual men don't have a lot of power, and now the small amount of social and sexual superiority they held over women is being questioned. And that's got a sting. Benefiting from patriarchy doesn't make you a bad person, although it does very little to help you be a better one. The test of character, as with everyone who finds themselves in a position of power over others, is what you do with that realization. Patriarchy through most of human history is what has oppressed and constrained men and boys as well as women. Patriarchy is a top-down system of male dominance that is established with violence or with the threat of violence. When feminists say patriarchy hurts men too, this is what we really mean. Patriarchy is painful and violent and hard for men to opt out of and bound up with the economic and class system of capitalism. I found that when I speak to men about gender and violence, the word patriarchy is one of the hardest for them to hear. Modern economics creates few winners, so a lot of men are left feeling like losers. And a loser is the last thing a man is supposed to be. Losers aren't real men, desirable men, strong men, and if neoliberalism is creating more losers, it must be because men aren't being properly appreciated. And it's probably the fault of feminism and not fiscal management. Neoliberalism may have set up vast swathes of people to fail, but the real problem isn't allowed to be a crisis of capitalism, so it has to be a crisis of gender. Across the global north and south, people are realizing how they've been cheated of social, financial, and personal power by their elected representatives and unelected elites. But young men still learn that their identity and virility depends on being powerful. What I hear most from the men and boys who contact me is that they feel less powerful than they expected to be, and they don't know who to blame. The great obstacle... Nope, not yet. I'll tell you when. The great obstacle to women's progress is not men's hate, but their fear. The men's rights activists who organize to drown out and silence women on the internet are usually fearful, lonely creatures who are desperate to speak about gender, but are only able to do so in the context of shutting women down. That expression of fear comes from a profoundly childish place, a posture which is as fascist in its policing of gender roles as a playground bully, but which uses words like feminazi with apparent seriousness, because fighting for equality is what the Nazis were known for. It is as if by talking about the hurt that women experience, often just because we are women, we are somehow preventing men from speaking about the painful pressures of masculinity. Interestingly, for many men, the only time they do feel able to talk about their own suffering is that when they're trying to stop women from talking about theirs. In every other context, men and boys are discouraged from talking about their pain. Thinking in a new way about sex, gender, and power, call it feminism or masculinism or whatever the hell you like, as long as you do it, it can help men to process that pain. But it's easier just to blame women. As more and more women and girls and a growing number of male allies start speaking out against sexism and injustice, a curious thing is happening. Some people are complaining that speaking about prejudice is prejudice itself. Increasingly, before we talk about misogyny, women are asked to modify our language so that we don't hurt men's feelings. Don't say men oppress women, that's sexism, and it's just as bad as any sexism women ever have to handle, and probably worse. Instead, say some men oppress women. Whatever you do, don't generalize, because that's something men do. Not all men, of course, just some men. This type of semantic squabbling is a very effective way of getting women to shut up. After all, most of us grew up learning that being a good girl was all about putting other people's feelings ahead of our own. We aren't supposed to say what we think if there's a chance it might upset somebody else or worse, make them angry with us. I see this used as a silencing technique across the social justice movements with which I've been associated. Black people are asked to consider the feelings of white people before they speak about their own experience. Gay and transsexual people are asked not to be too angry because it makes straight people feel uncomfortable. And so we start to stifle our speech with apologies, caveats, and soothing sounds. We reassure our friends and loved ones that, of course, you're not one of those ones. You're not one of those racists or those homophobes or those men who hate women. What we don't say is, of course not all men hate women, but culture hates women, and men who grow up in a sexist culture have a tendency to do and say sexist things, sometimes without meaning to. We aren't judging you for who you are, but that doesn't mean we're not asking you to change your behavior. What you feel about women in your heart is actually of less immediate importance than how you treat them on a daily basis. You can be the gentlest, sweetest man in the world and still benefit from sexism and still hesitate to speak up when you see women hurt and discriminated against. And that is how oppression works. Thousands of otherwise decent people are persuaded to go along with an unfair system because changing it seems like too much bother. The appropriate response when somebody demands a change in that system is to listen rather than turn away or yell as a child might that it's not your fault. Of course it's not your fault. I'm sure you're lovely. That doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility to do something about it. Society tends to discourage us from thinking structurally. Pondering upsetting things like poverty, racism, and sexism as parts of a larger architecture of violence does not come easy in a culture that prefers that we all see ourselves as free-acting individuals. But the body politic is riddled with bigotry like an infection. You can't see it or touch it until it breaks out on the skin, but it's there under the surface, bursting and suppurating in individual wounds that suggest something else is going on there. Your friend is raped by another friend at a party. Your colleague has to leave work because she can't afford full-time childcare. Your daughter comes home sobbing that she feels fat and refuses to eat dinner. It's simpler and less scary to imagine all of these things as individual, unrelated experiences rather than part of a structure of sexism that infects everybody, even you. It's relatively easy to hold more than one idea in the human brain at a time. It's a large, complex organ, and it has room for many seasons' worth of trashy TV plotlines and the phone number of the ex-lover you really shouldn't be calling after 6 shots of vodka. If the brain couldn't handle big structural ideas at the same time as small personal ones, we would never have made it down from the trees and built things like cities and cinemas. It should not, therefore, be as difficult as it is to explain to the average human male that while you, individual man, going about your daily business, eating crisps and playing Bioshock, may not hate and hurt women, men as a group, men as a structure, do hate women. I do not believe that the majority of men are too stupid to understand this distinction, and if they are, we really need to step up our efforts to stop them running almost every global government. Somehow it is still hard to talk to men about sexism without meeting a wall of defensiveness that shades into outright hostility or even violence. Anger is an entirely appropriate response to learning that you're implicated in a system that oppresses women, but the solution isn't to direct that anger back at women. The solution isn't to shut down debate by accusing us of reverse sexism as if that will somehow balance out the problem and stop you feeling so uncomfortable. Sexism should be uncomfortable. It is painful and enraging to be on the receiving end of misogynist attacks, and it is also painful to watch them happen and to know that you are implicated even though you never chose to be. You are supposed to react when you're told that as a group you're a member of is actively fucking over other human beings, in the same way that you're supposed to react when a doctor hammers your knee to test the nerves. If it doesn't hurt, something is horribly wrong. Saying that all men are implicated in a culture of sexism, all men, not just some men, may sound like an accusation. In fact, it is a challenge. You, individual man with your individual dreams and desires, did not ask to be born into a world where being a boy gave you social and sexual advantages over girls. You don't want to live in a world where women get raped and then told they provoked it in a court of law, where women's work is poorly paid or unpaid, where we are called sluts and whores for demanding simple sexual equality. You did not choose any of this. What you do get to choose right now is what happens next. You can choose as a man to help create a fairer world for women and for men too. You can choose to challenge misogyny and sexual violence wherever you see them. You can choose to take risks and spend energy supporting women, promoting women, treating the women in your life as true equals. You can choose to stand up and say no. And every day more men and boys are making that choice. The question is, will you be one of them? Now.
Wonderful, thank you. A rousing start to our conversation. And as Laurie said, we're going to have a bit of Q&A here. We're also going to open the mics early for audience questions. So start thinking about what you'd like to ask Laurie. My first question is on this idea of lost boys, which is the title of today's talk and the title of the chapter that you just read from. Who to you are the Lost Boys?
Well, the Lost Boys is this reference to Peter Pan. For anybody not familiar with Peter Pan, even the Disney film? Come on, everybody knows it. Yes, okay. I'm going to take that silence as agreement, as the internet teaches us. So the idea of Lost Boys is people trapped in this sort of eternal, nervous, childish state, unable to move on to what is being still sold to men as the appropriate sort of adulthood, and angry about it, trapped in this never land of rage. And I called it Lost Boys because it's about sympathy as well. You see a lot of young people in general, I've seen over the past, 6 or 7 years now that I've been writing, which has more or less coincided with the economic crisis since the crash of 2008. I've seen a lot of young people, and particularly young men, lose their way and lose their way within the economic system, lose their way within the job market, and that has been reflected in gender and power relations. There is a sense of loss of power and loss of privilege for men as well. And I think for a lot of people, particularly people around my age, I'm in my late 20s, are thinking, wow, well, not only is the economy going to hell, and not only am I not moving on in that way, the basic privileges that I grew up expecting without even really knowing I was expecting them over women, and as a man, they're being taken away from me as well. And so it's easier to get angry at feminists and get angry at individual people on the internet than it is to, take down the government, which is generally.
So how can these lost boys find themselves or
my
find
goodness.
a way?
Well, I mean, see my previous statement, really, in some ways. But look, I think one of the first most important things to do is understand that feminism is about empowering everyone, ultimately. I think feminism offers an enormous opportunity to men as well as to women to think in a different way about what it means to be a human being. I think ideas about masculinity are incredibly constricting and limiting for men as well, and the fact that the old models of patriarchal power are becoming less and less accessible for men is a really important opportunity to junk those models and to say, look, how can we live in a different way? How can we exist in a different way? Because that stuff's not working. That's just not working for most people. Most people are made miserable by this ideal of violent masculinity that they are held up to. I'm sorry if I'm talking in too theoretical a way. It's been a very long week.
No, it's
and I'm just going to start saying patriarchy like a robot until somebody... Anyway, next question.
Maybe we can get a chant going. Patriarchal makes some waves.
It's like Beetlejuice. If you say it more than 3 times, patriarchy comes out of the mirror and tweets at you.
As you say, feminism is for everyone. Why do you think men and conversations about men haven't been very present in the feminist movement?
Well, look, for good reason. Partly because it's one of the few places where we can have a conversation without men interrupting us all the time, and I think that is that's valid. Look, I mean, honestly, look, how many times have you been to a talk where 2 women are sitting on stage talking about something that is unrelated to gender issues? Ever? Guys? No? Right, you see what I mean? Look, we're only allowed to talk amongst ourselves and be respected on a political stage when we're talking about gender, and it's refreshing to have that conversation. And feminism is called feminism for a reason, is because it starts with women's issues and it recognizes that everybody is oppressed by gender. Women are the most oppressed, right? And that has to be understood and recognized. And a lot of people doing feminist work will say, quite rightly, when men come to them and say, oh, I've got a problem and I need to talk to you about my problem, which is kind of the substance of quite a lot of emails I get, and it's like, oh God, I file them away and I try and reply. But a lot of people who get those emails are like, this is not my job, I don't have time for this, please go and sort this out by yourselves. And that's okay, that's fine, but for me, technically speaking, it is my job. As a feminist writer and as an activist in various forms of, well, I mainly write on the internet. Who am I kidding?
That's not the internet.
It's not the internet. It's really on paper. It's real. You don't know what's in it, though. It's just pictures of dicks. I just carry it around to make me look clever.
When things get a bit rough, just flick through.
Everywhere. Yeah, but look, I completely forgot what we're saying. But yeah, look, well, as somebody who works in that area, I think it actually is my job to respond to some of these. And I have found more and more over the past few years that I've been contacted by men asking me questions and saying, and some of them, I get contacted by a lot of guys telling me various ways in which I should be raped and dismembered and sending bomb threats to my house. But I also get contacted by guys, it's almost like an agony aunt thing, saying like, I think I'm a feminist, will it go away? I've got this funny rash. It's like, no, it will never go away. Hopefully. But yeah, it's... feminism does provide an opportunity for men to talk about their issues and men to talk about the issues of masculinity, because masculinity is the one thing, and men's issues, sort of the issues of gender, are the one thing that men are not allowed to speak on and instantly be experts. And I think that's okay. I think men coming into feminist space without automatically being the assumption being that they will be the experts and they will be taking over the space is sort of rule one. It's the first rule of Feminist Club for guys. It's like, the test of how good an ally you're going to be is the way that you behave the first time you come into feminist space. Because for a lot of guys, saying to them like, oh my goodness, maybe you're not going to be in control and considered to be the expert in this discussion, it's impossible to voice that to men without them hearing you say, we hate you, we want you to shut up right now. It's like, no, we just want you to start off by listening. That's all.
Why do you think it is so hard for straight white men to grasp the concept of privilege?
Oh my goodness, I don't know. I don't know. I think there is a certain. I don't think the concept of privilege is hard. I don't think it's hard, and I think like I said, look, if it is that. If straight white guys are that stupid that en masse they cannot understand the simple distinction between privilege and power, privilege being social advantage that you get because of what you are rather than who you are, power being objective power. If that distinction is too hard for you to understand, maybe you should not be running the world, basically. But I think there is willful ignorance. I think people don't want to understand the difference between privilege and power because maybe then they would have to acknowledge it and have a conversation about it, And at the same time, it's just like, we don't understand. Yeah, they do. They do understand. They just, yeah.
And you talk about that being a very painful process for men and for anyone who comes to grasp it.
Yeah, I think all consciousness raising is painful. It's really painful, and it's painful when I've been through it myself. It's painful. I don't think anybody falls out of the womb with perfect politics. Nobody does. And I think this is this delusion on the left that everybody starts out, and that anybody can start out having the right opinions about anything. Politics is a process of growing and changing, and it's always painful, especially if you're confronted with your own complicity. Like, as a white person being confronted with your own complicity in structural racism. It's really horrible, and it makes me really uncomfortable, and I don't want to think about it because it's really bad. It makes me feel horrible. But you know what's more uncomfortable? Racism. Dealing with your complicity in structures of sexism and misogyny, similarly, is really uncomfortable and it's painful, and you have to think again about your own conceptions of gender and what you may have done in the past. But experiencing sexism is worse than that. And it's something that, again, we talk about guys, there's this idea of men as being like strong and, resilient and not letting anything get to them. But like these things seem to be just far too painful for men to cope with right now. And I think that's a shame. Basically.
I think it's a shame too. One of the things you touched on in your talk is the need for structural change. And, in our society, we do tend to look at incidents of misogyny or violence very independently. Why are we too timid or unable to look at the structural problems?
Oh, look, there's a couple of reasons for that. Well, there are lots of reasons for that. There are, in fact, structural reasons for that.
And complex structural reasons.
Which are not tweetable. But if you read my book, priced at only... Which
is longer than a tweet and very worthwhile.
It's made up of several hundred tweets, basically, because the internet has destroyed my ability to think in a structural way. That doesn't actually happen. People will tell you that happens, that the internet, it destroys your ability to think structurally. I don't think that's the case at all. But... look, one of the reasons, as a journalist, I think one of the simple reasons that we are encouraged not to think about instances of misogyny and hate crimes as structural is, this is not as maybe as interesting, but it is a simple fact that individual instances of misogyny are easier to report on, and they're easier to write about, and they're more sensational to write about. I saw So the other day there was a campaign, and the people behind that campaign, I think, are here today. They came to the earlier talk that I did with Clementine Ford and other people, and what happened was a girl was slut-shamed on Tinder, and all these misogynist attacks went right around the internet. And I was reading about this, and I was reading the news reports about this in the Australian media, and the first one I was sent to, whoever had put the title on that news report had chosen to take out of context a Facebook comment that somebody has left. So the title of the news report was, I think I'm quoting here, "Raping feminists is so much fun because they're nice and tight," or something like that. I'm like, I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, it was, and that was the title of the news report. It was like, that's not actually news, is it? Though that's misogynist titillation, and there is a culture of. So, has anybody seen Mean Girls? Yeah. Okay, so you know how she's trying to make fetch happen in New Girls, and she keeps trying to make. It's like, don't stop making fetch happen. It's never going to happen. I'm trying to make news economy of misogyny happen, and I have to accept that it's probably never going to happen. But I'm trying anyway. We have a news economy of misogyny, and that's one of the reasons that we don't want to think structurally about these problems. But I think thinking about sexism as structural and thinking about sexism and gender issues as an economic problem is terrifically frightening, because it means that it makes us feel less in control. Mm-hmm. It makes us feel less in control of it's scarier to think about a system that is oppressing you. It's scarier to think that there are huge economic forces outside any one individual person's control that are contributing to this culture, and it's easier to just punch down. Honestly, it's the same reason why it's easier to attack individual women and individual feminists than it is to get angry at society.
And you talk about in your book and in other places as well how you think feminism's gone as far as it can without big structural change happening.
In many ways, yes. Maybe that's wishful thinking, because I think there is still a lot of basic stuff that feminism needs to achieve within the paradigm of neoliberal. I really need to learn to say the word neoliberal capitalism. I'm sorry. Neoliberalism.
Or we need a catchy acronym or something.
Yeah, like money culture. I don't know. Within the paradigm of let's go for free market economics, shall we? That's easier to say. That we have. I think there is still more to do, but ultimately, okay, let me see how I can explain this briefly. The system that we have, and the system that enables capitalism to continue as it has, is predicated on an incredible amount of unpaid and underpaid work done by women. Women as carers, women as people who raise and bear children, and the fact that that work is unvalued or undervalued, and the fact that that work needs to continue to be done and to be done without complaint, is the economic basis for women's oppression within the system, and has been for many thousands of centuries. This is the basis for women's physical oppression, for attacks on abortion rights, for rape and slut-shaming, the economic basis for sexual control of women. And this is the real root of the way we have to understand sexism today. That's the brief explanation.
In your book, you talk often of revolution, mutiny, ripping things down, starting again.
Yeah.
What does a revolution look like to you? How do we get started?
Partly this is because I never got the career as a song lyrics writer as I wanted to. Like, I always wanted to be in a band, but I was never popular enough at school. So I can never. But look, one of the reasons I keep using the word revolution is because it's provocative and because it asks for big sweeping social change. But one of the reasons I use the word mutiny sometimes is that I think mutiny can be more personal. And in the the 60s, people used to talk about revolution in the head, and revolution starting within the individual human being. And I think in many ways that was and still is a cop-out, because if revolution stays in the head, then it doesn't have to go out onto the streets and challenge the system, right? But on the other hand, feminist writer Shulamith Firestone, who passed away a few years ago, said, a revolutionary in every bedroom would certainly shake up the status quo. And because so much of women's oppression and men's gender oppression too takes place on such an intimate, personal scale, because it's about relationships, because it's about sex and sexuality and intimate violence and partner violence and the lessons that we grow up with, dealing with mutiny on an individual level actually is important. Sexism reproduces itself, and a culture of misogyny reproduces itself on an individual level, because it is a process of cultural subjugation as well as a set of laws. Another way to think about this is, so look, we have a lot of legal change over the past 40 years. A great many legal changes have been a great many legal changes have been pushed through, which mean that on paper, women just about have equality to men within the current system. You know, we have the equal right to be oppressed at work, blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, that's what it is, right? And so we've won. We can all work in a call centre. Hooray! For neoliberalism, liberal patriarchy. This is both a challenge and a opportunity, because there aren't many specific legal changes that we can ask for. There are some. We can ask for huge sweeping changes to the law on reproductive rights and abortion rights. We can ask for changes to the codes on domestic violence, on rape. There are changes, but there aren't so many huge legal changes we can ask for to change the status of women as second-class citizens and the oppression of men in the world. But the good thing is that we don't have to sit around asking for legal change. We can just do it. We can do it on a cultural level, and that is what gives me so much hope when I look at what's happening online, when I look at conversations that are happening, when I look at, God, how many fucking people have turned up today? You know? I think it's really hopeful, and I use the word mutiny because I'm really into pirates. I'm really into pirates, but also it's about taking control of your own ship. It's about getting rid of the captain in the head and taking control of your own ship, however you identify, whatever your gender identity is, and that's why I think mutiny and revolution can go together. So that's it.
Let's talk about rage.
Okay.
You've written that if anything can save us, it's the rage of women and girls. What do you mean by this?
Well, look, I get away with being angrier than I think quite a lot of feminist writers in the public eye, because I'm physically really tiny and white and, like, I don't know, like, all of those things. But women are expected to not be angry first and foremost, and women and any oppressed group is expected to take into account the feelings of the oppressing group first before we speak about our issues and before we speak about structural power and structural violence. And I think there is a broad feminist movement happening right now which is saying, fuck it, and saying that we're not prepared to no longer be angry and no longer express what we're really feeling. And women's rage is something that has scared men for many, many centuries. And, you know, the image of the angry woman, it crops up in horror so much. So many of our ghost stories are about angry women. You look right back through culture. Fear of women's rage is so prevalent in society because women's rage is powerful when it is collectivized, just as the rage of any oppressed group is powerful when it is collectivized. And I think the first step is women ourselves learning not to fear our own rage and learning not to fear our own anger, and that being angry is a legitimate reaction to all the bullshit that's going on in society. And I want to say, I know that we have spent quite a lot of this talk talking about women when a lot of people came to a talk that was meant to be about men. And I want to say, get used to that.
And of course, one of the ways that men often undermine women is by calling them mad, telling
Crazy,
them to calm down,
angry,
crazy.
calm down. Yeah. Like, no, why would I do that? Everything is awful. Why is anybody calm? It's like, maybe that will be the title of my next book. And it'll just be pictures of dicks inside.
Or it could be an agony aunt book for male feminists, emerging male feminists.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing, I don't know if you have this T-shirt, but it's gone all over the US and the UK, this bloody keep calm and carry on T-shirt. I think that's one of the most awful pieces of political positioning I've ever seen. Like, that's exactly the least appropriate response to anything that's going on in culture. And in politics right now, I refuse to keep calm, I refuse to carry on. It's the last thing we should be doing. But that's more of a general statement than a deep theory about gender, which I think is...
I'm about to open up for audience questions. So if you do have a question, there's a microphone here and here. So just make your way down there now. I do just want to ask you about the Occupy movement, which you were very deeply involved in, and you wrote about it extensively. What did you see and learn during the Occupy movement?
Oh, God. Well, first I want to say I was not involved in the Occupy movement as such. I reported on it as a journalist. Yeah, it sounds like I did a load of activist work, which I just didn't do and I can't take credit for. But travelling around and following Occupy, I learned two things. I had my hope reaffirmed that people working together can create change very fast and can create a mood of change, and all it needs is the space for people to come together and talk about how the world can be different to create that opportunity for change. And the second thing I learned is how fucking fast people will crack down on that. Because one of the things I saw most of, it wasn't just following around the Occupy movement and seeing their lovely soup kitchens, which they had, and looking at the libraries, which they brought in, people donating food. It was then, a few days later, seeing the library at Wall Street just loaded into the back of a van and crunched up in the back of a digger. It was seeing, young people have their hands broken. A young girl who was having an epileptic seizure right in front of me with her hands cuffed behind her back, seeing the police just beating and clubbing and gassing people and then saying, oh, you weren't organised anyway, what are you doing? You've gone. Why have the Occupy movement gone? God, quitters. And it's like I literally saw the police tear apart that camp, and I'm sure they would have lasted a lot longer had that not happened. I learned just how threatening different ideas can be. And that was a hard lesson for a lot of people, particularly a lot of people who joined the Occupy movements and followed the Occupy movements who had not previously been involved in politics. And I think a process of recovery is still happening. But I hope that, I have no doubt that we will see different movements emerge in the next few years along those lines. I don't see any way they cannot happen, honestly.
So do you think Occupy has had a lasting impact?
Oh, yeah. It's okay to say the word capitalism now. Yeah. It has changed the conversation in the United States. And it has changed the conversation about economic justice around the world. And the fact that it quickly became apparent that was what was happening was one of the reasons I believe that this was shut down so fast.
Because it was so threatening to the status quo.
Yeah, it's hugely threatening. And you're seeing in Europe the traditional centre-left and centre-right mobilise against people's movements, both within and outside the traditional parliamentary process. Syriza, Podemos. In the UK, we've got Jeremy Corbyn, who's like this old leftist, is suddenly emerging to take control of the Labour Party, and everybody is losing their shit over this. It's hilarious if it weren't. It would be hilarious if it weren't so depressing, seeing them literally organising a purge of members so this guy doesn't get involved. And his ideas aren't actually that radical. He's not calling for armed revolution right now. He's suggesting a small increase in the top rate of tax upon the super rich. This is not like lamppost territory we're talking about. But these ideas are so threatening, they are just clamped down on instantly. And I think we need to it's a lesson in how resilient we're going to have to be in the next few years.
Great. We might go to Mike 2 for the first question.
Thank you. Hello. What do you think of gender neutrality?
What do you mean by gender neutrality?
So, I have a teenager, and apparently a friend's teenager has declared herself gender neutral. And I read parenting kids that they are gender neutral. I don't really know what gender neutrality means, but I wonder if there's a movement to not identify with a sex, what impact that has on being a feminist or being a male in a patriarchal society.
Okay, so thank you for the question. I want to say that my answer on this will be quite, I guess, specific, and I can't speak for the whole queer movement. I don't think there is a definitive answer on this one. But look, I identify as genderqueer myself. I am not so super public about that, but I'm going to start to be more so soon. Like, yay, coming out in front of hundreds of people. Can I have a little round of applause? Thanks. That was better than I thought it would be. But I have long sort of struggled with where the genderqueer and trans movement fits into feminism, and certainly where my own feminism fits into being genderqueer. And I think one of the important things is decoupling sex class and decoupling sex from identity in that way, which is, look, for various reasons I consider transfeminism and the presence of women who are transsexual in particular to be not just, appropriate in the feminist movement, but vital to it. But I also think that ceasing to think of human identity as binary is really radical and really important. And I think for a lot of people who are genderqueer, they maybe wish that it wasn't so radical and important. They would just rather be left to get on with their own thing and be gender neutral. And I hope that in the future that will be possible. But at the moment, gender neutrality and being genderqueer or agender or however you want to identify, I think that certainly has a place both within feminism and within a radical discussion of masculinity, decoupling the notion of masculinity from being assigned male at birth. And again, I'm not in this talk, I'm using the words, when I say men and women, I'm talking about political categories. I'm not talking about forever two categories of human being, because apart from anything else, that's just biologically wrong. There aren't just two sexes. There are a significant, small proportion of people who biologically don't fit into those categories, never mind in terms of identity. This could be a really long conversation between you and me. And yeah, I want to let somebody else ask a question, but thank you for that opportunity. Yay.
So I'll go to mic 1, and I'll just say there's a queue of men lining up to ask you questions. I'd love to encourage some more women. Mic number 2 is open. Please take your chances, but mic 1 now, thanks.
I'd just like to ask, sorry. You've mentioned masculinity and the oppressiveness of masculinity. Sports plays a huge role in our society culturally.
Yep.
A male who doesn't identify as even watching a sporting code can be kind of oppressed by that. And in contrast to that, women's sports is totally underrepresented with regard to the airplay that it gets worldwide. Do you think that sports in general have a role to play in the over-masculined society that we have? And would we be better off seeing women's sports to be more represented in that same sphere to give a bit of a balance? Would that empower women as maybe men feel empowered by that cultural identity?
God, this is a really interesting question.
I bet you didn't think you were going to be asked a question about sport today.
No, and I'm completely the wrong person to ask this question because, as you can see, I'm super sporty. No, look, I've always been a nerdy, weedy goth, and I hated school sports so much. And one of the best bits about leaving school was never having to do that again. And I still have flashbacks. It was awful. I can't imagine how much more more awful it was for, I went to a posh British school, and the guys that I knew well enough to speak to at school, they would come in from the rugby field with like broken noses, broken arms, and this was considered like part of education. And it's rather than like sort of brutal and fascist and terribly but look, so I have a really hard time talking about organised sport in a positive way. Like, I do yoga to a heavy metal soundtrack. And I think if you ask, my sister is a competitive climber, and my cousin is on the UK netball team, and I sort of want to hand this question over to them.
Guess if I could narrow it down,
yeah, go on.
Do you have a view about, I guess, the contribution of that negative kind of masculinity that sports has? Do you believe that it contributes negatively, given that a lot of the younger generation idealise these sports people and they're massively overrepresented in media and in our culture?
Well, look, it certainly seems to me from the outside that within the sporting world, like football, for example, or these massively overplayed football players, that culture is somehow like 10 years behind the rest of discussion. Like, for example, it's really, really hard for football players to come out, right? Whereas within other areas, other professionals find it much easier to come out. There's still a huge problem with racism in sports, where obviously there's a problem with racism everywhere, but it's the things you hear coming out of sports reporting are different. But again, like, look, I'm going to have to honestly pass on this, dude, because I'm too prejudiced. Like, I'm not the kind, like, never let it be said that I do not recognise when I'm just too bitter and twisted with rage to give an honest answer on a question.
Thank you. I think you answered beautifully. We'll go to Mike 2.
Hello, thank you so much for today. It's been amazing. Look, I just wanted to talk about rage, because I think women, that PMS and that rage issue is massive. Like, I've never taken the pill because I've learnt my system myself, but women are still pushed to take the pill to basically, minimise their libido, minimise their PMS raging. Oh, you can't be angry, you can't be sad, you have to be neutral. And it's even going back to what that mum was talking about with her children. So are girls and boys being brought up to believe that we can't be emotional, we can't have rage, we can't have anger, and that's really still, it's like a reverse of what all these women have fought for, that women were once arrested for having bikinis on the beach, women were arrested for, possibly being out at night because they're thought of as a woman of the night, obviously a sex worker. So is this still predominant? And secondly, when boys try to date you on social media now, why do they always send a dick pic?
Maybe start with the second question.
The second, look, has anybody ever seen a site called ratemydickpic.com?
Yes.
It's so good.
Critique my dick pic,
and it treats them as art. But God, I don't know. I don't know why people think that is what people want. I think it is just I think it's using technology to do a very basic thing that human beings maybe did before there was even language. It's like, mine is biggest. See, I will tweet a picture of it. No, but actually that was reverse sexist of me, and I will stop that. But,
hashtag not all men.
Hashtag not all dick pics.
It's quite entertaining, but I've got a psych degree, and I'm still trying to work out exactly what the momentum is behind it.
I'm trying to work out how they do the angles, actually. It's like, literally, where are you holding that camera? It's like,
they've got like the lighting going, the torch.
But look, I think, rage is pathologised, and it's pathologised within our culture in general, and not just for women. I think the more you look like, say, one of the average members of parliament, the more you look like the white, straight, cisgender, middle-class, English-speaking dude in your mid-40s and above, the more angry you're allowed to be without it being considered crazy. And there's a whole other conversation we can have about mental health diagnoses, about the politicization of mental health, and about how that deviates from real suffering. But there probably isn't time to get that. I will send you, if you tweet at me, an article I wrote on it on the internet.
All right.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Is there a question at mic number 1?
Firstly, I'm not really into sport, so I don't even have a team. It's about, I guess, culture and the stories that we tell ourselves. And I went to your last session this morning, and everything's happening now and at the coalface, and we need people like you to fight now against what's happening now with the adults now. But what I'm really concerned about are things like the fairy tales that we read our kids, the blue-pink dichotomy, and you've got to give Marvel credit because they are starting to actively try and create new female heroes, but you go and watch the last Marvel movie and there's like 10 dudes and one chick and she still needs to be rescued and have a kid. So it's like, if we go to the stories we're telling our kids and in terms of the culture, how important is it changing it for the next generation and starting to tell stories where women don't need to be rescued, where men don't need to be heroes?
Thank you for this gift of a question. Yeah, I think it is vital that we tell different kinds of stories. One of the reasons for this is, look, men grow up, and particularly white men grow up, learning that they're the heroes of their own stories, and watching and reading stories where all different kinds of people who look like them are allowed to have adventures, and they're allowed to imagine themselves in all kinds of situations. Women and people of colour are taught to empathise with and imagine themselves in the roles of those white men. Men, particularly white men growing up, are never encouraged and empathise with female heroes or heroes of colour, which is where you come back to, and I'm going to be like, hey, I'm a nerd, but this is where you come back to the huge argument over whether there was going to be a female Doctor Who, the assumption being that men can never empathise with a female Doctor Who, whereas women can, of course, empathise with a male Doctor Who. I think and in geek culture and in a lot of culture around creating stories right now, there is a huge amount of anger over the fact that those stories are starting to change. We don't have equal representation in writers' rooms or in, people who win prizes for writing and for novels and stuff that's being put out there. But because it's becoming a little bit more diverse, there is a huge backlash, and people are getting angry. Like, people are so angry about the female Ghostbusters film. They're so cross about that, my God. And it's like, people are saying things like, a female Ghostbusters film, you've just ruined my entire childhood. And it's like, wow. Your entire childhood was based on this very flimsy, fragile idea that 4 men could hunt ghosts. Like that, I really feel for you, dude, if this is your identity. But yeah, I'm this is not a plug because this might not work out, but I'm trying to start writing like fiction and stuff myself because I think it's politically important, and probably it's not going to work out because I'm way too political for it. I'm just going to be like, do you see the violence and the sexism? And then they fought the sexism and they won, and it was fantastic. That's going to be basically my novel. So it might not be very good, but something really exciting is happening now though, is because the people who grew up on the internet and grew up with LiveJournal and all different kinds of understandings of what diversity was, and are just now starting to get power in Hollywood and writers' rooms, and it's just now starting to change. So I think you'll see something. I'm really interested to see what's going to happen when the kids who grow up watching cartoons now get to about my age, and I'm really proud of myself for getting through that whole question without descending into a rant about Steven Universe. But it's really good and you should all watch it. It's so gay.
We probably have time for one last question. We'll take it from over there.
I grew up in regional Australia. I've got 2 younger brothers. They're in their 20s. They're just really regular guys. They work trades. They play footy on the weekends. They go to the pub. My question is around creating relatable conversation that isn't too cerebral, that's not too wrapped up in the rhetoric of some really big ideas, when my brothers are just the kind of guys who engage with mainstream media. So how do we start to create relatable conversation? And maybe relatable's a bit of a loaded word as well, but a conversation that for them they're unconscious of their privilege and they have no reason to engage with it because it's not in front of them. So how do we start to talk about them, have those conversations with guys who are at the pub, I guess?
Okay, thank you. Look, I think part of the answer to this relates to the previous question, and it relates to a general change in culture and people. You know, I think for all that I love reading feminist theory, I think Mad Max did a lot, as much good as any massive book of feminist propaganda, right? Yeah. And it's about, you know, asking people to live in a world where there is space for women's stories too. But I wanted to sort of end with this anyway, but it's a challenge to the guys in the room, basically, and the male-assigned people in the room, because one of the ways to get men to listen to arguments about feminism and about gender equality and masculinity, sadly, at the moment, is to have a man say it, and to have the real tests of who you are as a feminist ally and as a feminist man is how you behave and how you talk about gender when women are not in the room, and how men talk about gender to each other and talk about their own experience. And I would say, like, my challenge to the men in the room is to just try for a while, maybe let's say for 2 weeks, try having one conversation with another guy about gender or feminism or masculinity or something like that every day. Just try for a while and see what happens. And I am not responsible legally for any negative consequences that may ensue. But that's a challenge anyway. So, thank you.
That's a wonderful challenge. And I hope all the men in the room do take up that challenge, and all the women in the room hold them accountable for taking it up. Our time here has ended. Laurie will be signing books in the foyer now, pretty much. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Please thank Laurie Penny.